I guess it's not considered good form to start by admonishing your audience, but I don't think it's a time for cheering. In fact, it's not easy to talk about this topic at all when we're just short of a decision that's going to mean the slaughter of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, and that may set a large part of the world in flames. And that's exactly what is soon going to happen. I suppose there's still possibilities that it may be averted, but right now they look pretty slim. Well, as I say, it's not easy to talk about it calmly, but since I really can't think of much else to do, that's what I will proceed to do for what it's worth. At least we can try to understand what's going on and use such understanding as we can get as a basis of making some reasonable decision about how to respond to this and many other things like it that are going to follow. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait on August 2nd, there were two responses, and they were both very strong and pretty much unprecedented. One response, which went through the United Nations, was sanctions and embargo, and those sanctions were of unprecedented severity. I mean, there's been nothing remotely like them, even in cases much worse than this latest crime of Saddam Hussein's. The other response was preparation for war, quick preparation for war within a day or two. That preparation for war had nothing to do with the annexation of Kuwait. In fact, it took place well before the annexation, so it had to do with the invasion. And at the time that it took place, there was essentially nothing to distinguish Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait from, for example, George Bush's invasion of Panama a couple of months earlier, which was probably more bloody and destructive. Now, these two responses separate world opinion quite substantially. The first response had pretty broad support, at least in the industrial world, the sanctions. And sanctions, of course, means negotiations. Sanctions means that you put pressure on through some economic means, leading to a negotiated settlement of some kind. And diplomacy, there's another word for diplomacy. It's called linkage. That word is a new one that was kind of invented here, and we're supposed to be against it. But it's just another word for diplomacy. Diplomacy means, you consider relevant issues and you try to reach some solution to them. But since we're supposed to be against it, a new word was necessary, and that's linkage, which is bad, and therefore everybody's against linkage. So the first response is sanctions and diplomacy equals linkage, and that had pretty broad support. And what was surprising about it is not that it took place, because there's often broad support for broad opposition to aggression, but that it could get implemented, that sanctions could be implemented, which is rare, and also that they were so severe, which is also very rare. The second response, preparation for war, that was very limited. In fact, it was limited to the United States and England, with very weak support from others. Also, the family dictatorships that run the Gulf states, they're in favor of it, and Israel's in favor of it. But but it's basically a two-member partnership, U.S. and England. If you look at the military structure, you'll notice that two military forces are under a command structure to fight, and the others are kind of hanging around the periphery to the extent that they're there at all. The other major countries in the world didn't want to have anything to do with it. The European community and Japan, the other two major power centers, European community outside of England, made it pretty clear at once that this was none of their business. They were not going to support it even financially. In the third world, it's very split. Much of it is, in fact, against any of the responses. In the Arab world, there's a sharp division. It's been noted, and it's worth paying attention to, that the division in the Arab world pretty much has to do with the extent to which a country has some degree of responsiveness and openness to public opinion. By and large, the more a country has some form of pluralism and elements of democracy, it tends to be opposed to the U.S. presence in the Gulf. The countries that are more in support of it are the ones that are more repressive, narrower, have no openings. That's pretty much the case. And it's been noticed. The New York Times specialist on the Middle East, Judith Miller, pointed out that the countries that have what she called nascent democratic movements are opposed to the U.S. presence. And administration spokesmen have also noticed it and have spoken about it and have pointed out that their conclusion from that is that we have to strike fast. Because if you, especially if you let things run into the Islamic religious periods around March, the Ramadan and the pilgrimage, the Hajj, then even the totalitarian states have a tough time keeping a lid on public opinion, and therefore the whole thing may collapse. So the conclusion is strike fast. And incidentally, the same conclusions are drawn about the home front. Unless you strike fast, there'll be an expression of public opinion. Well, you can draw your own conclusions from that both the lessons that it teaches about statecraft and the prospects for action. Anyhow, there were those divisions. George Bush likes to talk about how it's the world against Saddam Hussein, which is something of an exaggeration. It certainly is the industrial world and parts of the rest against Saddam Hussein. But it's also, in this respect, the world against George Bush, or to be more precise, against George Bush and whoever happens to be sitting in 10 Downing Street at the moment, varies. But it's the U.S.-British coalition that's pretty much breaking with world opinion on that, and has been from the beginning. Now, that raises a number of questions. We want to understand why the United Nations was able to act, which is very unusual, why the actions were so unprecedented in severity as they were. You can't think of another case where there was an embargo on food, for example, even in much worse cases than this. And, of course, the crucial question is why the United States and England are alone, aside from the family dictatorships in the Gulf, pretty much alone. Well, let's hold those questions in the back of our minds for a second and be clear about what, in fact, happened next. What happened next is that within days of the invasion, well before the annexation, the United States moved decisively to undercut the possibility that sanctions might be effective. That was done instantly. The immediate response from Washington was to announce the sending of a huge expeditionary force. Now, a deterrent force, largely offshore, that could be kept in place for a long time, long enough for sanctions to take effect. And these sanctions are very likely to take effect. It's two major reasons for that. One is their unprecedented severity, and the other is that the usual sanctions busters, namely the United States and England and their allies, happen to be on board this time and vigorously on board. So it's not like South Africa. So this time it's very likely that the sanctions would work. But of course it takes time for sanctions to work. And a huge expeditionary force can't be kept there more than a couple of weeks or maybe months at the outside. Furthermore, there's this problem that I mentioned before. You can't keep the troops too long or the Arab world blows up because nobody likes it. So you got to do it fast. That wouldn't be a problem with a deterrent force. So the purpose, certainly the effect and the predictable effect, so I assume the purpose of announcing right off that there would be a huge expeditionary force, that must have been, the effect obviously was, and the purpose must have been to undercut sanctions, to make sure that they can't work. And within the first couple of days, it was clear that sanctions were not an option. Well, what about diplomacy, the other aspect of the peaceful means prescribed by international law, sanctions and diplomacy? Diplomatic opportunities began to crop up from very quickly, within a week or two. By the end of August, there were several that looked pretty significant, including Iraqi offers that were regarded by high U.S. officials as serious and negotiable. The offers at that time basically had to do with, as you've all heard plenty of times by now, with two uninhabited islands in the Gulf and with a particular oil field, the Rumaila oil field. This oil field's about 98% inside Iraq, crosses a disputed border, and Iraq wanted control of the whole thing. The uninhabited islands, they have to do with access to the Gulf. The imperial settlement imposed by England was set up in such a way that Iraq is basically landlocked, and access to the Gulf would involve control over those two islands. There could be lots of ways of working this out, leasing or whatever. Much harder problems than that have been settled through negotiations, and a settlement along those lines looked feasible. Was it feasible? Well, we don't know, because the United States rejected it flat out of hand. The only way you can find out if a proposal is serious is to pursue it, obviously. And rejecting it out of hand was a way of ensuring that it wouldn't be serious. In fact, it was probably an expression of fear that it might be serious. The New York Times had a pretty remarkable story. Thomas Friedman, the diplomatic correspondent, which that means essentially the State Department spokesman at the Times. That's the nature of that office. He had quite a perceptive article, I thought. I think it was around August 22nd, in which he said that the administration wants to prevent the diplomatic track from being pursued because of fear that pursuit of the diplomatic track might defuse the crisis. That was his words, by offering a few token gains for Saddam Hussein, namely, and then he mentioned them, a couple of uninhabited islands and some, border rectification. And you don't want to diffuse the crisis when you can have a neat war with, a couple 100,000 people killed, apparently. So that the Times actually had this offer leaked to it and suppressed it, and it was only released, and then marginally when it was then leaked to a suburban newspaper in New York, Newsday, which published it very prominently on the front page. So it was all over the newsstands in New York, and you had to at least have dismissive mention of it in the back pages the next day. Well, since that time, there have been repeated offers. The most recent one that's been made public, at least, was disclosed on January 2nd, again in Newsday. The reporter, it's a good reporter in Newsday, Newt Royce, Washington Bureau, who's been following this topic very closely. On January 2nd, he reported that the U.S. officials had disclosed that there had been an Iraqi offer a couple of days earlier, and that offer was to withdraw completely from Kuwait in return for a pledge not to attack the withdrawing forces and to reach arrangements or settlement or something kind of vague, to do something about two major regional issues. One of them, the issue of the Arab-Israeli conflict, particularly the state of the Palestinians, and the second issue was weapons of mass destruction in the region. So in return for some kind of Security Council commitment to deal with those two issues, there could be complete withdrawal. Well, was that offer serious? We don't know, because the United States dismissed it instantly. Again, high State Department officials described it as a serious pre-negotiating position, as an indication that Iraq wants to withdraw from Kuwait, and noted specifically that it didn't say anything about the border issues, dropped them. Well, that one didn't get much publicity. The New York Times, however, which didn't report that, did report the same day a meeting between Yasser Arafat and Saddam Hussein, in which Arafat said that they had agreed that Saddam Hussein had made a proposal back on August 12th to withdraw, or at least to link Iraqi, all these things are kind of vague, to link Iraqi withdrawal to withdrawal from other occupied Arab territories. That means Syria and Israel from Lebanon, and Syria and Israel from the Syrian Golan Heights and the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And according to the January 2nd report, January 3rd in the Times, this was now weakened to just a commitment to deal with those issues. So withdrawal in response to a commitment to deal with those issues. Well, that was also rejected. Anyhow, 2 weeks before the deadline, things looked like this. The contours of a possible settlement were Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait in return for a pledge not to attack the withdrawing forces, and a commitment to settle regional issues. No settlement of them, just a commitment to settle them. That was rejected, so we don't know if that was serious. and all of that is indicative of a strong opposition to diplomacy, very strong opposition to diplomacy. These are certainly well within the range of negotiable positions. But the United States didn't want to hear of them, and they were flat out rejected, and therefore we haven't any idea, and we'll never know, whether that offered a way of avoiding a major catastrophe. That has continued up until just a couple of hours ago. Last night, France made a proposal at the Security Council for Iraq, calling for complete and rapid Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait in return for, and then comes wording, vague wording about calling an international conference at an appropriate moment. Not even saying when, but sometime or other, calling a commitment to call an international conference at an appropriate moment to consider the Palestinian issue and the Arab-Israeli conflict. That was the proposal. That was flat out rejected by the United States, instantly. The United States and Britain rejected it outright. Also the Soviet Union, but at this point the Soviet leadership would stand on their heads and sing Yankee Doodle if they thought they could get American support, so that's irrelevant. But England and the United States instantaneously rejected it on the usual grounds, linkage, meaning diplomacy, and you can't reward aggressors and all this posturing. Now, what the UN ambassador, the American UN ambassador said, Thomas Pickering, he said, you can't accept this because it doesn't keep to the UN resolutions on Iraq and Kuwait. And he's technically correct about that. The wording is not drawn from those resolutions. It's drawn from a different UN decision, Security Council decision. Namely, it's drawn from a Security Council decision on December 20th of last year, which had absolutely nothing to do with Iraq. It had to do with protection of the rights of Palestinians under Israeli occupation. It was a resolution which called for, I think 681, which called for called on Israel to observe the Geneva Conventions and to stop deporting people and to protect the rights of Palestinians under occupation. Now, that resolution was passed unanimously. The United States voted for it too. And attached to, then came something kind of unusual. Attached to that resolution was a codicil, a statement attached to it, which said, not in the resolution, but attached to it, which said members of the Security Council agree that in the interest of peace, they will proceed at an appropriate moment. That's the crucial wording. They will proceed at an appropriate moment to call for an international conference to deal with the issue in order to reach peace. Now, why wasn't that in the resolution? Well, because if that phrase had been in the resolution, the United States would have vetoed it, right? Remember that this had nothing to do with Iraq. This word Iraq or Kuwait never got mentioned in this resolution, just had to do with the Palestinians. But the United States was going to veto it if it said that at some appropriate moment in the future, there would be an unspecified when, so at some moment in the future, when it's appropriate, whatever that means, there might be an international conference on the Palestinians. If that was the case, the United States was going to veto it. Nothing there about linkage. And the French offer simply drew that wording and tried to work it into a resolution on Iraq. So Pickering, the ambassador, was right in saying the wording wasn't drawn from Iraq resolutions, but it was drawn from another resolution or an addition to a resolution just a couple of weeks earlier. Well, that's where that indicates the depth of the commitment of the United States not to allow diplomacy to work. Can't allow it to work, even in any fashion whatsoever. Even the weakest gesture toward diplomacy has to be blocked. The U.S. from the start insisted that diplomatic contacts be limited to delivery of an ultimatum. You're allowed to deliver them an ultimatum saying capitulate or die. That's diplomacy. And that's what George Bush calls going the extra mile for peace. Most of the press, including even people who ought to know better, like Fred Kaplan of the Globe, who's a good reporter, have described this as a tremendous forthcoming effort to explore every possible diplomatic path and so on and so forth. Fact is, it was flat rejection of diplomacy from the first instant. Now, looking back, we have the following situation. There were unprecedented sanctions. There were diplomatic options. The United States moved at once to undercut the sanctions and moved at once to undercut the diplomacy and has kept to that position ever since. Well, what are the reasons for this? You've heard them 10,000 times. We can't reward aggressors. You can't have linkage, and so on. You know, it just offends our moral sensibilities to allow our aggressor to get anything. So therefore, you know, we got to smash him in the face. Now, you know, it really doesn't, we don't have to waste any time discussing this. The only reason for even spending 3 seconds on it is that this has been accepted at face value virtually across the spectrum. So, for example, if you listen to the congressional debate, you'll notice that, I mean, I didn't hear the whole thing, but just about everybody, maybe everybody, every word I heard at least, accepted the legitimacy of this. And most of the press has accepted the legitimacy of this. There's been very little questioning of the rhetorical stance. There's debate, but the debate is over, you know, tactics. Is it good for us or is it bad for us to pursue this just course? Now, because the rhetorical stance was never challenged, the debate was pretty much restricted to a tactical frame. Is it good for us or is it bad for us to proceed? And in that frame, the administration is going to win, obviously. You know, I mean, it's debatable, and so you go along with power. Of course, if the rhetorical stance had ever been challenged, it would have collapsed instantaneously, and that would have been the end of the debate, because it's impossible to uphold even one fragment of this position for 3 seconds. And the reason for that is very simple. In fact, the reason is one of logic, basically. The point of logic is that you can't uphold principles selectively. If you uphold some doctrine selectively, it's not a principle. I mean, that's transparent, and we don't ever doubt that. So, for example, when Saddam Hussein tells us, you know, that he's agonizing over the human rights abuses of the Israelis in the occupied territories, and he clutches to his breast the Amnesty International report on Israeli atrocities, which is pretty awful, incidentally, or when he tells us he's against annexation, namely he's against annexation of the Golan Heights, we don't say he's a man of principle. You know, you laugh. And exactly the same reasoning holds true when George Bush tells us that he clutches to his breast the Amnesty International report on Iraqi atrocities in Kuwait, but not a long list of others you might think of, and that his, you know, can't go to sleep at night because of this thought that an aggressor's not being punished, and so on and so forth. I mean, these are jokes. Incidentally, in the third world, my impression, we don't get much information from the third world, but my impression is that they were regarded as jokes. It's kind of striking that until the last couple of days even, people in the third world didn't seem to think that this was going to happen. I was down at a conference in Mexico last weekend, and nobody took it from people around Latin America. Nobody thought this was for real. They all thought, you know, this is never going to happen. People from the Middle East have had the same reaction from right in the region. And I think the reason for that is pretty simple. When we hear Saddam Hussein's posturing, we laugh. When they hear George Bush's posturing, they laugh. What they don't realize is that in the United States and England, people don't laugh. They take it seriously. They don't understand the deep totalitarian streak in Western culture, which means that you can get by with this kind of posturing and everybody takes it very seriously and somberly. And that's the kind of mistake that people in the third world have been making for a long time, in fact, for 500 years, ever since the European conquest of the world began, and they've paid quite a cost for it, and they're continuing to pay a price. Well, now it's clear that it's for real. It's instantaneous. I'm not going to waste your time on it, but the United States is one of the leading violators of all the principles that are grandly proclaimed. That's obvious. You know, anybody who's opened their eyes in the last 50 years or 100 years knows that, even the last year, in fact. And therefore, we don't have to argue any further about the stance. What about the matter of linkage or sanctions? Well, supposedly we can't be for sanctions because it'll take too long. Why will it take too long? Well, there's the argument given by the administration and by people in Congress is that one argument is, well, if you wait for sanctions to hold, the coalition will fall apart. Yeah, that's interesting. That's possibly true, incidentally, but that tells you something about the kind of support that there is behind the U.S. position. A second argument is that that sanctions will reward the aggressor. You know, it just hurts our moral sensibilities to sit by while we watch the aggressor, you know, benefit from what he's done. We got to move fast to stop this. You know, our sensitive souls from being seared by this sight. Again, that's not one you can take very seriously either. There are other cases where there have been sanctions, very porous sanctions, because, as I say, the United States and England and France and others regularly violate them. But take, say, South Africa. The occupation of Namibia was declared illegal by the United Nations and the World Court back around late 60s. For years, the United States carried out what it called quiet diplomacy and constructive engagement, 20 years, in fact. Meanwhile, South Africa robbed the place, you know, terrorized it, used it as a base for attacking its neighbors at a terrific cost. The UN Economic Commission on Africa estimated the cost to the neighbors alone, forget South Africa and Namibia, in the last decade, in the 80s. They estimated it at over $60 billion and 1.5 million lives. Well, meanwhile, our sensitive souls weren't seared. We went along with, nobody proposed bombing South Africa, nobody proposed withholding food. The sanctions, you know, they were violated all over the place. We went on with diplomacy. There was finally a settlement with plenty of reward for the aggressor, plenty of linkage, you know, linkage all the way up to Cuba. Everybody thought that was great, you know, great achievement of diplomacy. And the same is true in case after case after case. When George Shultz tried to broker Israel's withdrawal from Lebanon after a completely unprovoked attack in which maybe 20,000 civilians were killed, when he tried to, that was a partial withdrawal from Lebanon, plenty of reward for the aggressor, and plenty of linkage. So, you know, Syria was ordered to get out, no negotiations with Syria, you just give them orders. That's linkage with a vengeance. Same was true after Israel's invasion of Sinai back in 1956, which the United States didn't like that time, so it kicked them out, but again, with plenty of rewards for the aggressor. That's just standard. So this just can't be taken seriously. I mean, serious people can't waste a moment on this, so let's not. There's a conclusion that follows from this, incidentally. The conclusion that follows is that no reason has been offered for going to war. And I mean no reason. I mean none. There has none whatsoever. There's been simply no argument. The reason is that every single argument is transparently fraudulent, not complicated fraud, trivial fraud. And that means whatever's going on has nothing to do with the reasons that are being presented, some other thing. Well, let's come back to the original questions. Why were the sanctions implemented? Well, one reason, the answer to that is also trivially simple. The sanctions were implemented because the United States for once permitted it. Usually the United States doesn't permit the UN to carry out its peacekeeping role. That's why it doesn't carry it out. For the last 20 years, the United States is far in the lead in vetoing Security Council resolutions. In second place is the other one of the righteous avengers in the Gulf, Britain, mainly because of their protection of the racist states of Southern Africa. Between them, the United States and England, which are now standing on high principle, account for about 4/5 of the Security Council vetoes during these last 20 years. In third place, well behind, is France, and in fourth place is the Soviet Union. Well, you know, we're now told over and over again that one of the really important things is this great new world order, which, you know, will finally, you know, will have peace and the UN will be able to function, because the Soviet Union has lost the Cold War, and therefore they're not going to block the UN anymore. Well, you know, it takes 3 minutes to figure out who's been blocking the UN. I should say the same is true in the General Assembly. And there's not the slightest reason to suppose that with the Soviet Union out of the game, the United States and Britain will suddenly call off their campaign against international law and against the United Nations. That doesn't make any sense. Why should they? In fact, they'll carry it out more vigorously. There's less in the way. There's no prospects for a new world order or a great new era. In fact, quite the contrary. I should say, incidentally, that in this case, too, I think if you take a careful look, you'll notice that the United States also undercut the peacekeeping function of the United Nations, but in a more complex way. Usually it just does it by vetoes, straight vetoes, so nothing can happen. In this case, the United Nations did move toward sanctions, and the United States, as I said, undercut that instantly, undercut the sanctions option and undercut the diplomacy option. That's undercutting the peacekeeping mission of the UN. There were lots of threats and pressure and cajolery, and finally what in effect happened is that the UN washed its hands of the matter. This famous UN resolution that was passed basically says nothing. It says use any necessary means, doesn't tell you what necessary means are. They can be diplomacy or sanctions, or for those guys who want to kill a lot of people, they can be kill a lot of people. But that's a decision for the individual states to take. There's no UN resolution that uses any phrase like minimal use of force or anything of that kind. The UN has mechanisms, Security Council has mechanisms to call for military force. It specifically didn't use them. And the United States, incidentally, didn't want it to use them because those UN resolutions were intended as nothing more than a weapon against Congress, so that you could turn to Congress, people in Congress, and say, you guys aren't as patriotic as Malaysia or something. That's it. Now, this whole record is one of simply undercutting the United Nations in a slightly different fashion than the usual one. Why were the sanctions of such unprecedented severity? Well, that's easy to answer, too. It's because of tremendous U.S. pressure. U.S. is a scary place, and people don't stand up against it. It's dangerous and frightening. And if the U.S. is putting a lot of pressure, it's also powerful. And if the U.S. is putting pressure on, people tend to go along. They're not going to stand up against, you don't stand up against a violent, lawless terrorist state. And what happened is the sanctions were imposed. Again, it's not explicit. There's nothing explicit in the UN. In fact, the UN resolutions don't even call for enforcing sanctions, if you actually read the wording. But it was interpreted the U.S. way, block everything, including force. So that answers the first set of questions. Very simple. The UN could act because the United States for once permitted it to, instead of blocking it as is usual. The reaction was particularly harsh because the United States twisted a lot of arms and scared a lot of people. And that's about all there is to it as far as the first questions are concerned. What about the more interesting ones? Why are the United States and England isolated on this issue? Well, that's important to look at. Here you have to look a little more carefully at what's going on. So let's start with this latest Iraqi offer disclosed by U.S. officials, remember, to withdraw from Kuwait in return for agreements on two major issues, regional issues, the Arab-Israeli conflict and weapons of mass destruction. Why won't the U.S. permit that? Well, I've already mentioned that the U.S. is opposed to an international conference quite independently of anything having to do with Iraq. And in fact, we know that because the U.S. has been opposed to an international conference long before Iraq invaded Kuwait. So the argument that we're now opposed to it because of linkage, that can't be true. We were opposed to it before, quite apart from the fact that we standardly reward aggressors, even much worse cases than this. So that's not the answer. What is the answer? Well, the answer to that is also painfully simple. The United States is opposed to a diplomatic settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and it's been opposed to it for a long time. And it's isolated on that. The last vote at the United Nations last year was 151 to 3. The three were the United States, Israel, and Dominica. Now, that's the kind of unanimity you never get at the United. All the NATO allies voted against us. Everybody did. I mean, maybe one or two countries were sleeping or something. But it was basically the world against George Bush, you know. By a much larger majority than the world against Saddam Hussein. Well, that's why that's the way it's been for 20 years. The United States and Israel have been essentially alone in blocking a political settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which has been supported by the whole world. Well, that tells you why they're against an international conference. What's going to happen at an international conference? No matter how you pick the people, you pick them as you like. There's no way to, unless you pick just Dominica. At an international conference, there's going to be pressure, and that'll probably change, it'll probably change the day after the vote when they paid them off. At any international conference, there's going to be pressure for a diplomatic settlement. And the United States doesn't want a diplomatic settlement, therefore there can't be an international conference, period. Nothing to do with linkage, nothing to do with Iraq, nothing to do with anything. That's the way it's been for years. The United States has been vetoing Security Council resolutions, voting virtually alone against General Assembly resolutions, undercutting every possible initiative. This has been going on since 1970, 70, 71. Nothing new about it. That's what our blocking of the diplomatic process on this even has a technical name in the United States. It's called the peace process. We're pursuing the peace process, meaning blocking every conceivable possibility to get peace. And in fact, occasionally you get an article like, will say somewhere, well, the Russians are, I remember an article in the New York Times saying the Russians are trying to come aboard, they're trying to get to join the peace process, meaning maybe they're going to accept the U.S. position in isolation from the rest of the world. If they do that, they'll be on the team being us by definition, even everybody else is off the team. Well, that's the way it's been for a long time, so therefore there can't be an international conference, and therefore we go to war. What about the second issue, the issue of weapons of mass destruction? Well, refusal of linkage on this one is particularly remarkable because this is a disarmament issue. And disarmament issues are always settled in a regional or global context. I mean, that's not even in dispute, right? Of course, disarmament issues are settled in a broader context, regional or maybe global, everyone is. But we reject it in this case. And once again, that rejection, though it's claimed to be based on linkage, has nothing to do with Iraq's conquest of Kuwait, and it's easy to prove that. We can prove it very easily by simply noticing that the United States also opposed a diplomatic settlement of that problem before the Iraq invasion of Kuwait. In fact, last April, when Saddam Hussein was still George Bush's great friend and favored trading partner, at that last April, Iraq made an offer to destroy its non-conventional weapons, to destroy its biological and chemical weapons. And that was turned down by the United States. The United States responded and turned it down because Saddam Hussein insisted that this be done in a regional context. That is, that Israel destroy its nuclear weapons and its biological and chemical weapons. Well, that's not entirely unreasonable, one might think. But the United States rejected it, and the terms of the rejection are worth listening to. The official State Department rejection said they welcomed Saddam Hussein's offer to destroy his own weapons, but that can't be linked. The United States rejects any link to other weapons issues. The other weapons issues were left unspecified. But of course, everybody knows what that means. That means Israel's nuclear weapons, which they've had for at least 20 years, probably a couple hundred of them. Now, you can't mention that. If you look at the U.S. diplomatic record, you'll notice that no spokesperson for the government ever refers to Israeli nuclear weapons. I mean, everybody knows they've got them. That's not even a question. But you can't refer to them. Why can't you refer to them? Well, there's a reason for that in American law. According to amendments to the foreign aid legislation back in the 70s, it's illegal under American law to give any aid at all, including economic aid, to any country that's engaged in clandestine nuclear weapons development. So therefore, if you concede that Israel has nuclear weapons, all aid to Israel has been illegal for years, and you can't concede that. So therefore, you don't mention Israeli nuclear weapons. But in order to preserve Israel's right to continue nuclear weapons development without mentioning it, of course, we reject the possibility of treating Saddam Hussein's military arsenals through diplomatic means, which is the right way to do it, and we go to war. That's the other element. Notice there are three issues here that are linked. One is Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait, another settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict and other regional security problems, and a third, the problem of Saddam Hussein's threatening military arsenals. There appears to be a diplomatic approach to every one of those three issues. The United States is opposed to a diplomatic settlement of each of those issues, and therefore it's opposed to linking them. Very simple. That's the answer to why we're opposed to linkage, meaning diplomacy, and why we go to war. Well, that gives you more understanding of what's going on. Britain is with us on this alone, virtually alone, except even on the Arab-Israeli conflict, even Britain's not with us. In fact, nobody is, except Israel. Well, that leaves basically really the serious question: why are the United States and Britain alone on this issue? Why is it the world versus the United States and England, which it pretty much is? That's a serious question because it's going to blow up a large part of the world very shortly, maybe getting started right now. So it's worth trying to understand it. Well, when you turn to the other questions are really trivial. I mean, every question I've mentioned so far shouldn't strain the intelligence of a 10-year-old. If it's not in the front pages of the newspaper, it's because they're trying hard not to understand it. There's nothing subtle about this. And you don't have to have any complicated knowledge of world affairs or be able to think through hard arguments or anything. You don't have to know anything. Everything that I've just said is basically elementary. And there shouldn't be any much confusion about it. However, this other question, why the United States and England are alone, that's harder. There you really have to speculate. You have to try to figure out what's behind policy decisions and so on. And it is speculation, so you could argue, but speculation doesn't have to be totally uninformed. There's evidence. There's evidence from history, and there's evidence from the current world situation. How am I doing on time? Should I go a few more minutes? Okay. Yeah. Tell me if I'm. So let's take a look at those two questions, those two issues. We know something about those. On the matter of history, there's some again pretty obvious points. There was an imperial settlement in that region, and that imperial settlement was imposed by the United States and England. It was in fact imposed in such a way that they would be the beneficiaries of it. Given that fact, it's not too surprising to see that those are the two countries that are girding up for war in the Gulf while everybody else keeps their distance. Now, the history of this goes back to the early part of the century. Originally, it was England and France. They sort of had they ran the region. By the First World War, the United States was becoming a big actor in international affairs, and it wanted to get in too. So there was a British-French U.S. division around, by the 20s and the 30s. After the Second World War, the United States essentially took over. The relations of power were such that the United States was just overwhelmingly powerful. France was kicked in the pants immediately. They were kicked out of the arrangement on the grounds that France was an enemy state, and therefore the agreements with it, the treaties and so on, didn't mean anything. It was an enemy state because it had been under German occupation, so that got rid of France. Left England and the United States. The British tried to hang on, and the United States was not allowing them very much. There was a lot of conflict between Britain and the United States in the late 40s and the early 50s. It was pretty much resolved by the mid-50s under the dictates of the stronger partner. I mean, the United States wanted to keep Britain in the game. The reason for that was stated uncautiously in a secret discussion by a high Kennedy official, which later got declassified. He described England as our lieutenant, and then he said the fashionable word is partner. Now, you don't tell the British about this. They're supposed to have delusions of partnership, but, in secret, they're our lieutenants. So we want to keep them viable. That's called the special relationship. And by the 50s, it was a British, Anglo-American condominium with the U.S. calling most of the shots, of course. Now, there's an earlier history, needless to say, and even if nobody remembers it here, they probably remember it elsewhere. So just in the case of that, right after the First World War, the British were having some problems holding together the empire. Britain was weakened by the First World War, and that meant it was kind of hard to keep the lid on things. And they had to get pretty violent, in fact, to do it. That's when the Amritsar massacre took place in India in 1919 with about 400 unarmed protesters massacred. There were similar problems in Iraq, and England didn't have the manpower to put it down. They didn't have the troops at that point. So they decided to innovate and turn to terror bombing of villages for the first time, which is cheaper. You don't need a lot of force for that. Now, also, the terror bombing of villages was used even to collect taxes from tribesmen and that sort of thing. And it was pretty effective. But it wasn't quite enough. The RAF, Royal Air Force Middle East Command, in 1919 requested authorization for the use of chemical weapons as, I'm quoting, against recalcitrant Arabs as experiment. Now, chemical weapons, that means poison gas. At the time, that was regarded with the ultimate horror. You know, this was right after the First World War. It was ultimate revulsion was poison gas. So they requested authorization to do that. The India office didn't think it was a very bright idea. They thought it would have negative consequences. But they were overruled by the Secretary of State at the War Office, who dismissed what he called this squeamishness over the use of gas. And he declared himself to be strongly in favor of the use of poisoned gas against uncivilized tribes. That was Winston Churchill, incidentally, one of the great moral heroes of the West. It kind of went on from there. So, you know, there is an earlier history. But let's put that aside and turn to the post-Second World War period. The U.S. and Britain pretty much had it under control, but there was a break. There was a break in 1953 when Iran tried to take control of its own oil. That was taken care of with a CIA-backed coup. The big break, the serious one, was in 1958 when Iraq had a nationalist officers' coup, which overthrew a dependent regime and took Iraq out of the, partially at least, out of the Anglo-American condominium. Well, that caused a furor in Washington and London. One response was a Marine landing in Lebanon the next day to prop up the regime there. A second response was apparent authorization by Eisenhower of use of nuclear weapons in case any unfriendly forces went into Kuwait. Third response was a set of decisions by Britain and the United States about how to handle the situation. And the way Kuwait at that time was more or less a colony, although they called it independent. And the British decided that it would be a wise idea to give Kuwait at least nominal independence to try to undercut the possibility that a nationalist revolt might spread there. However, reserving the right to intervene by force, or as they put it, ruthlessly to intervene if anything goes wrong, no matter who's responsible. The United States reserved the same right for the rest of the region. In fact, they jointly agreed that the oil fields of Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the other Emirates, that they be kept in U.S.-British hands. They were very clear about the reasons. The reasons were, and they're important because they're still operative, and in fact more operative than ever, the reasons were, first, Britain, which had an ailing economy then, not worse now, but an ailing economy, needed privileged access to the oil of Kuwait and, crucially, to investments from Kuwait in order to prop up its economy, which had to prop up sterling, which was extremely weak. So that was a major condition. Now, by the early 1970s, those very same considerations were applying to the United States. The United States was losing its world dominance. In fact, it was seriously losing it from an economic point of view, and it began to need not the oil so much, but the profits from oil. Oil creates huge profits, and control over those profits gives you plenty of power. And the United States started needing them. Also, of course, control over oil gives you a good deal of influence over people who need oil. It's a lever of world control, you know, a significant lever. But so you got several reasons. One, access to the oil on preferential terms. Two, a lever of world control. But three, just the profits alone. They're necessary. And by the early 70s, that was beginning to be serious. Going back to 1958 for a moment, the National Security Council, the highest planning body, in decisions that have now been partially declassified, it isn't too much declassification of U.S. records, incidentally, because the Reagan administration, which had a kind of a fascist element to it, imposed very heavy restrictions on declassification. They didn't want the public to be able to see what's going on. So things get declassified now with very heavy restrictions, so much so that the State Department historians all quit a few months ago. But anyhow, enough went through so you can see what was going on. The National Security Council decided in '58, after the Iraqi coup, that the U.S. should be prepared to use force if needed in order to secure British and American interests in the region, in Kuwait and other parts of the region. That tells us a lot about what's going on now. As I say, by the early 70s, the U.S. needed the investments and beginning to need the access to the oil as much as the British did at that time. We're a little behind them in this. In fact, this is one of there's been a very substantial capital flow from the Gulf oil producers to England and the United States, other places too, but primarily England and the United States, and that's propped up their financial institutions, their corporations, and their general economies. Just purchase of treasury securities by Saudi Arabia props up the American economy. In fact, when the oil price goes up, what in fact happens is dollars shift from one bank to another in New York, and pounds shift from one bank to another in London to a large extent. Prices go up, a lot of petrodollars, but they get spent, and they get spent on on exports and construction firms and so on, primarily in England and the United States, and a lot of it goes straight to, they purchase up parts of ailing banks and treasury securities and so on. That's been a big shot in the arm for the U.S. And British economies. British for a long time, and the United States for the last 20 years. That's a good reason for keeping control over this system. These are all good reasons. That's one of the reasons why the United States and England have not been particularly opposed to rises in the oil price. In fact, sometimes they favored it. After the big near quadrupling of oil prices in the early 70s, that actually improved the British and American economies, helped them. The balance of trade between the United States and the oil producers improved in the U.S. favor, after the oil price went up. It quadrupled. That's for exactly the reasons I mentioned. Also, the rise in oil prices helps countries that produce high-cost oil. There are two such countries primarily, the United States and England. The oil corporations knew about Alaska oil a long time ago, but it wasn't profitable enough. After the price quadrupled in the early 70s, it became very profitable, so they started producing it. Same with North Sea oil. All of that is good, and also, quite apart from that, the energy corporations are all U.S., with some minor exceptions, they're basically U.S. British, and their profits go up as the oil price goes up. So these are all parts of the system, important parts. Well, without going on, you put all these things together, you see some pretty good reasons why two countries are getting ready to go to war, just as they said they were going to do back in the late 50s, and probably since, but we don't have documents since. We do have documents up to then, and we know what they say, and they make a lot of sense. And you can look at the record since and see it follows the same lines. Well, there's one final point to make about this, and here we really do speculate. That has to do with the current world system. And take a look at what the current world system is like. There's a lot of talk about this fabled New World Order, and there's something to it. There are changes in the world. In fact, there have been changes in the world for the last 20 years, and important ones. About 20 years ago, it was becoming quite clear that economic power was diffusing in U.S. domains. It was diffusing into three major power centers: German-led Europe, Japan and its region, and the United States and its region. The United States is still the biggest, but not very much anymore. And in fact, the Reaganite policies severely harmed the American economy, and those costs have not yet come due, but they're serious. The Vietnam War harmed the American economy. It was very costly to the United States, very beneficial to the industrial rivals of the United States. And all of that stuff changed the structure of the world economy. That's a major part of the New World Order. Three major powers, the U.S., especially after Reagan, now deeply in debt and much weakened. That's part of the New World Order. What about the Russian, 5 minutes, yeah, I'm just about done. What about the disappearance of the Soviet Union? Well, by the mid-'70s, it was pretty clear that the Russians were in bad trouble. In fact, their military expenditures started leveling off, exactly the opposite of what we were told at the time, but the CIA has now conceded it. And by a couple of years later, it's pretty clear that they're finished. And the effect of that is, there's several effects to that. One effect is rhetorical. Since 1917, every American intervention anywhere has been in defense against the Russians. That's, like when the U.S. began to support fascist Italy back in 1922, as they did. That was in defense against the Russians, and everything up until then has been in defense against the Russians. By about 1988, that becomes impossible. I mean, even the most fertile imagination can't say we're defending ourselves against the Russians, so you need other excuses. That's one change, new rhetorical framework. The invasion of Panama was historic in this respect. It was just like everything that's been going on for a couple hundred years in most respects, but it was different in that you couldn't say we were defending ourselves against the Russians. So one change is rhetorical, and that's happening again in the Gulf. A second change is more significant. The Soviet Union and its empire are now opened up freely to Western exploitation. That is, they're reverting to what they were before 1917, quasi-colonial dependencies of the industrial West. And that's a big change. But of course, the United States and Britain are not ahead in that game. Germany's ahead, and Japan, when it decides to get into it, will be ahead. But Britain and the United States are not capital-rich countries. They can't do that. So that's a second development, not good for the United States and Britain. Third major development is that although the world is tripolar economically, it's got one military power. And furthermore, that military power is now a lot more free to use military force than ever before because there's no deterrent any longer. Soviet deterrent is gone. 10, 15 years ago, the United States could not have sent massive conventional armies to the Middle East. Now it can do anything it feels like. That gives the U.S. a lot more freedom to use force. Well, you put these things together and you get a certain picture. Everything I say about the United States is also true of England, but at a much lower scale, so I'll put them behind. I'll keep the lieutenant out of the story. We have three major military powers, three major economic powers, one major military power. That military power doesn't any longer have the economic base to carry off intervention. Well, some consequences follow, and they're drawn. So, for example, when Deputy Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger was testifying to Congress a couple of weeks ago about the New World Order, he said the New World Order will be based on what he called a kind of new invention in the art of diplomacy. Namely, we carry out intervention, other people pay for it. Well, who's going to pay for it? The Germans and the Japanese are not that happy about paying for it. They're quite happy to see the United States and England go down the tube so they win the Second World War. They're not going to pay for it. And there's only one other big source of capital in the world. That's the Gulf oil producers. In fact, that's the way you make the Germans and the Japanese pay for it, via the oil price coming back here. Okay, so that's the way you pay for it. However, notice that there is a shared interest with Germany and Japan and the whole industrial world. Namely, somebody has to keep the third world under control. This war against the world that's been going on for the last 500 years, it still has to go on. And somebody's got to be there to make sure it works. You know, you try with the IMF and all that stuff. That's cost effective, but sooner or later you need the Marines, or the B-52s or something. And the United States is the only country that can do it. Britain secondarily, but primarily the United States. So somebody has to play the enforcer role, and that's got to be us. And that is now being openly discussed in the international business press, for example, where it's pointed out that the U.S. must play even more than before what's called the mercenary role. The United States has to be the Hessians, the guys who who keep the third world under control, and other people pay for it. If there's a diplomatic settlement, it's of no particular advantage to the United States. If there's a capitulation to force, it's of considerable advantage to the United States. It shows that our comparative advantage is important. Our comparative advantage is in the use of force, certainly not in diplomacy. We've always been against diplomacy, but not even anymore economically. However, force we rank supreme. If you can show that force is the crucial device for controlling the world, you're better off. And I think that's another reason why you got two powers sitting there in the Gulf. Incidentally, the oil producers recognize this from their own point of view. A couple of weeks ago, or days ago, in fact, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal which quoted a high Gulf official as saying that he didn't see any reason for his son to die in Kuwait because we have our white slaves to do that. he hadn't looked very carefully at the skin color of the mercenaries there, and he'd also forgotten for a moment that the guys with the guns are going to call the shots. And if he gets out of line, he'll learn that very fast. But apart from that, it's sort of true. Last comment, there are domestic developments in the United States that are tending in the same direction. It's not a big secret that the so-called infrastructure is collapsing. The educational system's collapsing, the health system's collapsing, the inner cities are being destroyed. You may have seen the statistics that were published a couple days ago on prison population in the United States. The United States is way ahead of anybody else in per capita prison population, way ahead of South Africa and Russia, which used to be up ahead of us. For a black male, the probability of being in prison in the United States is 4 times as high as in South Africa under apartheid. That tells you something. All of this reflects an internal third world. That's business is worried. I mean, they're not worried because too many people are in jail. They're worried because half the jobs in the next decade or so have to be filled by blacks and Hispanics. And if you keep them in jail and in concentration camps called cities and so on, they're not going to be able to do any of the work that you need done. So they're expecting a big shortage of skilled labor, and that means that transnational corporations are going to shift those operations that involve skilled labor overseas to where there is skilled labor, educated populations and so on. That means everything from research and management and so on to product development and guys to push buttons on computers and so on and so forth. What happens to the United States? Well, maybe these guys can't do research, but they can truck around the desert, so they can be Hessians. That's another factor that's pressing in the same direction. Now, that's pretty much what the future is going to look like if it goes on the way it does. It's not for the usual victims, it's like always. For the citizens of the mercenary states, it's also not particularly attractive if they let it happen, and it might happen. That's the way things are moving. It's another thing that's going on in the Gulf. Well, what about policy choices? Your policy choices depend on what your goals are. If the goal had been to get Iraq out of Kuwait and to settle, to reduce regional tensions and to move, make a move towards a slightly more decent world, you would use sanctions and diplomacy and the peaceful means required by international law. If the goal, however, is to firm up the mercenary enforcer role and to establish the rule of force in the world, if that's the goal, then the policy choices that the Bush administration has picked have a certain chilling logic to them.